Aaliyah Boston says Kelsey Mitchell is the MVP. A lot of people say it's A'ja Wilson. But Caitlin Clark is making this conversation very interesting. Why? Look at the numbers. Over her last 10 games, 24.7 points a game, 9 assists, and she's shooting 47% from the field and 41% from three. That is an MVP level stretch. A'ja Wilson still has an incredible case. I mean, she's A'ja. And Kelsey Mitchell absolutely belongs in the conversation, but Caitlin Clark is making a late push that is getting pretty hard to ignore.
There was a moment this season when everyone in the WNBA agreed on one thing: A'ja Wilson was untouchable. Analysts called it one of the biggest gaps between the best and second best player anyone had ever seen in women's basketball. 4 MVPs already on her shelf, 3 championships, a resume that made her the undisputed standard. The conversation was closed before it even started, but then something shifted, and it didn't shift quietly. Caitlin Clark went from barely cracking a top 5 mention in some rankings to sitting at the #1 conversation in MVP voting. She did it without asking anyone for permission, without a press tour, without begging for respect. She just played basketball, and the numbers started doing something nobody expected. They started screaming louder than the doubts. Within weeks, a narrative that seemed set in stone started cracking. The player everyone assumed would coast to another MVP had a real challenger, and not just any challenger. Someone who was ranked 11th among her own peers just months earlier.
Caitlin Clark is also first in the WNBA in total points created. She is first in the WNBA in points per game created. She is first in points per minute when she is on the court. Leads the league in assists per game, and she is also 3rd overall in scoring this season.
This is how Caitlin Clark forced her way into history and how A'ja Wilson's grip on the throne started to slip. Let's talk about what happened in July, because it still matters and it's still raw. Back when summer rolled around and the season was about to tip off, the WNBA Players Association held a vote. This wasn't some random internet poll or a hot take from a sports bar. This was players voting on players. Professional athletes were asked to rank the best guards in the league, and the results came back with Caitlin Clark landing at number 11.
This guy said this is one of the biggest gaps between the best and second best player we've ever seen, talking about A'ja Wilson in the WNBA. And I'm confused because I'm seeing fans bring up Caitlin Clark. Like, don't get me wrong, she's really good, but she's barely the best guard in the league, let alone the best player in the league.
11th. That was the official peer ranking from the women who share the same court with her every single night. They saw her in person. They defended against her. They knew what she was capable of doing to defenses in real time. And 11th is where they placed her. The context makes it even more damning. At the time of that vote, Clark was 4th in league scoring. 4th, not 10th, not outside the top 10, 4th in an entire league of professional basketball players. She was also 2nd in assists in the entire WNBA. 2nd, and yet somehow, despite being 4th in scoring and 2nd in assists, she was voted 11th among guards. The logic doesn't connect. The numbers don't support it. But that's what the vote said, so that's what got published and shared across social media and podcast networks and sports media everywhere. The names that landed ahead of her in that same vote included Kelsey Plum, Jackie Young, and others who, if caught off guard in a conversation, would probably admit the gap between 11th and where Clark actually belonged was never even close to accurate. But admitting it would mean confronting the vote. So instead, the vote went public, and it stayed public, hanging over Clark's head like a scarlet letter nobody wanted to talk about directly.
All the MVP candidates on points generated per game, points scored, points generated, and by assists. Now, as you guys can see here, Caitlin Clark got hurt at the beginning of this season, but she's doing this with only 31 games. So when we sit up here and say Caitlin Clark is not the greatest, at least right now, you're lying to yourself because she clearly is. The numbers don't lie.
It became this thing that existed in the background of every conversation about her production. Here's where it gets interesting, though. When media outlets ranked guards, they put Clark 3rd. When fans voted on guards, they put her 2nd. But the players themselves, the ones actually defending against her night after night, the ones who felt her impact on the court in the most direct way possible, they voted her 11th. That disconnect was telling. That wasn't a difference of opinion. That was active dismissal. That was a statement being made without words. The animosity was real. You could feel it in how dismissive some of the commentary was around her. When respected voices like Candace Parker and Aja Wilson himself gave their MVP candidate lists mid-season, Clark's name wasn't mentioned. Not even as an afterthought. Not even as a "but what about?" Just complete silence. It was the kind of silence that echoes louder than any criticism because it suggests she wasn't even worth considering in serious conversations. That's worse than being criticized. That's being ignored. And here's the thing about that vote. It was petty. Not in a competitive way where you're trying to get an edge, in a personal way, because the numbers didn't support the ranking. They never did. Clark was doing things on the court that contradicted being 11th in anything. She was leading the league in multiple offensive categories. She was creating more points for her team than guards ranked ahead of her. She was distributing the ball at an elite level. She was scoring efficiently. The ranking seemed to age poorly the moment it was published, but that didn't matter because it was already out there. Some analysts tried to rationalize it afterward. Maybe, they said, the voters were protecting their own. Maybe there was friction about how much attention Clark was getting. Maybe some players felt threatened by how quickly she had ascended from college to being one of the most productive players in the league. Maybe the gap between rookie hype and actual performance made voters uncomfortable and they were hedging their bets. Maybe. But rationalizing it doesn't change what it was. It was a rejection. A coordinated effort to keep Clark down, to say without saying it directly that she didn't belong in the top tier of guards, despite every statistical measure suggesting otherwise.
And somehow 11th among guards, according to her peers.
Caitlin Clark, on a vote by WNBA players, was voted the 11th best guard in the sport. At this point, I think it's funny. Fans ranked her second, media ranked her third, WNBA players voted her as the 11th best guard. Indiana's scoring 94 a game. It's the highest in 16 years. She's the number one shooter, distributor, play initiator, playmaker. She's 11th. She's fourth in the league in scoring, second in assists, and she's the 11th best guard. I mean, the animosity toward Caitlin Clark, it's so petty.
The vote became even more absurd when you looked at the actual production numbers. Clark was fourth in scoring. Fourth, and yet somehow she was 11th among her positional peers. That's not a stat. That's an opinion. That's a subjective evaluation. And as one analyst pointed out, it was an opinion that was wrong the moment it was published. The problem was that nobody wanted to say it out loud until the numbers forced them to acknowledge it. They had to wait until Clark's production became so undeniable that there was no way to rationalize the ranking anymore. What made it particularly interesting and frankly petty was the timing of it all. This vote happened in the middle of a season where there was already skepticism around Clark. Some people had written off her rookie season as a statistical mirage. They said the league had adjusted to her. They said the hype had worn off. They said she wasn't as good as advertised back when she was dominating college basketball. The 11th guard ranking seemed to validate all of that narrative. It was official now. Peer confirmed. The story became, Clark is good, sure, but she's not elite. She's talented, definitely, but she doesn't belong in the conversation with the best guards in the league. She's solid, but not special. The disrespect extended beyond just the ranking, too. When hosts asked players about MVP candidates on podcasts, Clark's name kept getting skipped over. When sports media had discussions about the league's best stars, the conversation would go through 5 or 6 different names before someone even asked why Clark wasn't being mentioned. It was like there was an unspoken agreement among parts of the league to underrate her, to find reasons why she didn't quite fit, why she was good but not that good.
Caitlin Clark just made WNBA history. 45 points, 10 assists, and the Indiana Fever beat the Seattle Storm. And this wasn't just a career night, it was record-breaking night. First player in WNBA history to record 40-plus points and 10-plus assists in the same game. Set a new Indiana Fever franchise record with 45 points. Added another historic milestone to a career that's already rewriting the record books. And she did it all while still on a minute restriction. When Caitlin Clark is healthy, she changes everything. The pace, the spacing, the energy, and nights like this remind everyone why she is one of the biggest stars the game has ever seen.
Some of the disrespect was subtle. Some of it was blatant enough that anyone paying attention could see it. When Aaliyah Boston jumped into a conversation about MVP candidates, she made sure Kelsey Mitchell's name was mentioned specifically. But in that same conversation, neither Aaliyah nor Candace Parker brought up Clark, despite her being one of the most productive players on the court night in and night out. It sent a message, one that said, "We see you, but we don't acknowledge you. We know you're doing numbers, but we don't think you belong here." The irony is that this disrespect probably fueled what came next. Athletes are competitive. When they sense disrespect, when they feel like they're being dismissed by peers they respect and admire, it creates something inside them. A need to prove something. A drive that goes beyond normal motivation. A hunger that makes them dangerous on the court. Clark had to know what people were saying about her. She had to know she was ranked 11th by her own peers. She had to see the commentary, the dismissals, the way analysts questioned whether she really belonged in elite conversations. She had to feel that weight, and all of that sat with her. All of it accumulated. What nobody anticipated was how she would respond. It wasn't in interviews. It wasn't with quotes calling out the voters or defending herself against criticism. It wasn't on social media defending herself against the peer vote. The response would come on the court, and it would come soon. Within days, actually. And when it did, it would be so undeniable that nobody could spin it or explain it away or pretend it didn't change everything about how they viewed this MVP race and who belonged in it. 2 weeks after that 11th guard ranking went public and started circulating through every sports media outlet and social media platform, Caitlin Clark walked into a game against the Seattle Storm, and everything changed. Not gradually over time, not as the season wore on. In a single night, the entire narrative shifted because she delivered the kind of performance that nobody could rationalize away or explain with excuses. 45 points, 10 assists, 4 steals, 2 blocks. She became the first player in WNBA history to post a 40-point, 10-assist game in a single night. Not just a good stat line, not just an impressive game, a historic one. A first-ever, never-been-done-before line that the entire league had to sit with and acknowledge. The timing was almost too perfect to be real. Voters had cast their ballots and submitted their rankings just weeks earlier. They'd officially said she was 11th. They'd made their statement to the world about where she stood in the hierarchy of guards in this league. And then Clark answered with the loudest response available to her, a box score that nobody could spin, nobody could explain away, and nobody could argue with or diminish. 11 for 18 from the field, 6 for 10 from three-point range. Clutch 3 after clutch 3, especially in the fourth quarter when the game was still being decided and every possession mattered. She was hot in a way that transcended normal basketball performance. It wasn't just that she was making shots. It was that she was making them at exactly the right times, with defenders in her face, with the game on the line, with everything riding on her performance. The Indiana Fever were down 6 going into that fourth quarter, and Clark didn't just tie the game. She led a comeback where she scored 16 points in those final 12 minutes alone. 16 points, 3 assists, every big play when it mattered most. This wasn't one lucky shot or one good quarter where she caught fire. This was sustained excellence across an entire game, in the most clutch moments, under the most pressure, knowing the eyes of the entire league were on her. What made it even more impressive was the context that everyone kept ignoring or glossing over. Clark was playing on a minute restriction. She didn't play the full game. She didn't get the full 40 minutes. She played 29 minutes. 29 minutes to score 45 points and dish out 10 assists. That's a scoring average of over 93 points per 36 minutes of play. That's an assist rate that would lead the entire league if she played a full workload every single night. That's an offensive output that coaches were literally trying to limit by keeping her on the sidelines for rest and recovery purposes.
Caitlin Clark voted 11th best guard by WNBA players. That's crazy. I think people need to look at themselves in the mirror and realize, like, man, you got some insecurities if you sitting down and putting Caitlin Clark as the 11th best guard. Y'all need to go to a therapist and figure out what childhood issues you have. Because if you're sitting there and looking at yourself in the mirror and putting her as 11th best guard, and you're putting you as 8th best, like, come on, this is crazy.
She was still producing historic numbers in those restricted minutes. The message that sent was unmistakable. When Caitlin Clark is healthy, she changes everything about how a game unfolds. The pace shifts, the spacing adjusts, the energy of the entire team changes. She elevates everyone around her because they don't have to think about their own offense. They just move and space and cut and get ready for a pass because they know she's going to find them. The entire trajectory of a game shifts when she's on the court at full capacity. The performance sparked something in the discourse that had been missing before that moment. Suddenly, people were asking different questions. How do you rank someone 11th at their position when they're capable of putting up stat lines that only 4 NBA players have ever matched in their entire careers? How do you sit in a voting room with other players and exclude the player who's about to set a league record? How do you vote her down when she's about to make history? The votes started looking less like thoughtful analysis and more like pettiness that had been caught in real time. And that's the thing about disrespect like that, it doesn't stay buried forever. It sits there dormant, waiting for someone to prove it wrong. It waits for the numbers to catch up to the narrative. Clark proved it wrong in the most spectacular way possible, not with an argument, not with defensive words or explanations, with a stat sheet that made every voter have to confront what they'd done, with a box score that forced them to reconsider. The response from analysts and commentators was immediate and telling. One broke down the tape and marveled at the precision of her play, the way she was reading defenses, the way she was making passes that seemed impossible until she made them. Another pointed out that you have to shoot like that to overcome being disrespected. That talent eventually breaks through no matter how hard people try to suppress it. But the most telling response came from players who finally acknowledged what they should have acknowledged all along. The gap between where Clark actually was and where voters had placed her suddenly became impossible to ignore because the numbers were right there on the screen. What made this performance different from other great games throughout basketball history was that it didn't feel like an outlier or a one-time fluke. It felt like an answer. Like Clark was saying, without saying it directly, "You ranked me 11th? Here's what 11th looks like. Here's what happens when I'm actually healthy and fully engaged and have something to prove. Here's what I'm capable of when I stop playing to prove people wrong and just play to win." The 45-10 line wasn't just a great game. It was a statement written in statistics. It was her way of correcting the record without needing to hold a press conference or give interviews or engage in controversy. And the timing, that's what made it truly poetic and almost cinematic. She didn't wait 3 months to prove voters wrong. She didn't slowly climb back into conversations. She forced herself back in the very next time she stepped on the court with something to prove. Within days of being ranked 11th by her peers, she'd done something no other player in WNBA history had done. The contrast was stark enough that you couldn't ignore it, couldn't rationalize it, couldn't pretend the vote made sense anymore. The Fever's offense around her was also clicking at that point. They were scoring 94 points per game, the highest mark in 16 years. That wasn't a coincidence. That wasn't random variance. That was Clark's offensive gravity creating space, generating assists, forcing defenses to adjust, pulling defenders out of positions until the entire offense flowed through her hands. She wasn't just scoring, she was orchestrating. She was running the show. And in one night, she rewrote the conversation about who belonged in elite discussions about the WNBA's best players and who deserved recognition. Here's where we need to talk about what the actual statistics say, because numbers don't lie and they don't care about your preseason predictions or your peer voting or your ego or what you said in July when you were trying to downplay someone's abilities. The numbers just exist in their own objective reality, and right now, they're telling a story that's become impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Caitlin Clark currently leads the WNBA in points generated per game. Let that sink in for a second. Points generated. That's the combination of points she scores plus the points she directly creates for her teammates through assists. It's a stat that measures true offensive gravity, not just individual scoring ability. It tells you she's not padding a stat sheet by chucking shots and hunting for volume. She's running an entire offense through her hands and making every single possession more dangerous because she touched the ball. She's doing that more than anyone else in the league right now. She's also first in total points created. first in points per minute created. She leads the league in assists per game, and she's third overall in scoring this season. When you look at those four categories together, points generated, total points created, per minute creation rate, assists per game, and scoring, you're looking at a player who is elite across the board in every measurable offensive metric that actually matters. You're not looking at a specialist. You're looking at someone who dominates multiple areas simultaneously. But here's the part that makes it undeniable and almost unfair to compare against other candidates. She's doing this while playing roughly one full game fewer than the players she's beating in these exact categories. Think about what that actually means from a statistical perspective. Aja Wilson has played more games. Kelsey Mitchell has played more games. Olivia Miles has played more games. Every single competitor in this MVP race has gotten more opportunities to pad their statistics, more games to accumulate numbers, more playing time to build their total numbers. And Clark is still ahead of them. She is doing more in less time than everyone chasing the same trophy. That's not luck. That's not a hot streak that will cool down. That's not variance or statistical anomaly. That's operating on a different level than everyone else around you. That's a level of efficiency and production that defies the normal ceiling for players in this league. The record-setting performances have been relentless, and they've been coming fast. She already holds 19 of the 120 all-time 20-point, 10-assist games in WNBA history, and she's accomplished this in less than 3 seasons of professional basketball. Think about that. There have been only 120 of these games ever. She has 19 of them, in 3 years. She has 9 of those games this season alone, which breaks her own record from 2024. She's literally breaking her own records in real time. She became the fastest player in history to reach 700 assists, faster than LaMelo Ball, faster than LeBron James, faster than any point guard in basketball history at the professional level. Think about that for a second. In comparison metrics to NBA point guards, she's reaching milestones faster than 2 of the greatest players in basketball history. That's not a small distinction. That's a statement about her pace of play, her competence, her understanding of the game. She's also the only player in history to average at least 20 points and 8 assists in a single month, and she's done it 5 times already this season. She's on pace to be the first to average 20 and 8 in an entire season. That would be a historic first. Not just this season, league history. The kind of milestone that gets recorded in the record books and referenced for decades. No other player in the 29-year history of the WNBA has accomplished that, and Clark is on track to be that first player. When ESPN did their elite offensive impact rankings, looking at all the key offensive metrics that define modern basketball, Clark showed up in the first column across multiple categories. Third in points per game, first in assists per game, first in points created, first in points per game created. You're looking at a player who doesn't just dominate in one area. She dominates in multiple areas simultaneously. That's the mark of someone operating at an MVP level. Her efficiency metrics have also improved significantly as the season has progressed. She's shooting 47% from the field and 41% from 3 over her last 10 games. Those aren't just good numbers. Those are elite efficiency numbers that would be career high for most players. She's expanding her game in real time too. Her mid-range shot has become a legitimate weapon. She hit 32 mid-range shots this season, more than she hit in her first 2 seasons combined. That's not a small jump. That's a player actively improving while also leading the league in production. The context matters too, and it's crucial to understand. The Indiana Fever are scoring 94 points per game, the highest total in 16 years. That's not happening by accident or luck. That's what happens when your point guard is creating 40 points in a single game, when your offense is flowing through someone who sees the floor 2 steps ahead of everyone else, when your spacing is perfect because defenders have to respect the 3-point line and the mid-range and the drive. The entire team's offensive rating has skyrocketed because of what Clark does. The Fever have won 7 of their last 9 games by an average of 14 points per game. That's not competitive wins. That's dominant wins. That's blowout victories. And it started right after Clark returned to full health. They went from struggling to first in the East and 4th overall in the league. One player, one return to full capacity. That's what changed the trajectory of an entire franchise. Conference Player of the Week came 4 times this season. 4 separate honors. That's not a one-week hot streak that media outlets are overreacting to. That's a player being recognized over and over at regular intervals across an entire year. When a player earns that honor 4 separate times in a single season, it stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern that voters cannot keep pretending not to notice. The stat that really stands out, the one that ESPN flagged and that nobody has emphasized enough, is the points generated per game comparison. Clark generated over 40 points created in a single game earlier this season, the most by any player in WNBA history. Not this season, not in recent memory. League history spanning 29 years. That number represents the entire offensive impact she had on that game, and it's a record that will be hard to touch. When you stack all of this together, the points per game, the assists, the points created, the efficiency, the record-setting performances, the team wins, the peer recognition, you're looking at a player who has made a statistical case for MVP that's become almost impossible to argue against. The numbers don't care about what happened in July. They don't care about who was ranked where in preseason. They just exist. And right now, they exist in Caitlin Clark's favor. Now let's flip this around and look at a Ja Wilson, because this is where the frustration has to be setting in for someone who's spent the entire year repeating the same message on repeat. She's been the greatest since 1996, and nobody is taking her spot. She's earned the right to say things like that. 4 MVPs, 3 championships. A resume most players in this league will never come close to sniffing in their entire careers. But here's the problem with resumes: they're built in the past tense. MVP races are decided in the present tense. And right now, in the present tense, Caitlin Clark is outproducing a Ja Wilson. Let's be clear about something first before we go any further. A Ja Wilson is still an incredible player. She's still the best interior player in this league. She's still dominant. She's absolutely deadly as a mid-range jump shooter, hitting at a rate of about 45-46%, which is elite for a big man or anyone really. She can drive closeouts from that position about as well as anybody in the league. She's one of the best athletes you'll ever see play the game. One of the best mid-range shooters in this league. That's not changing. That's her resume, and it's substantial. But that's exactly the point that we need to examine. Wilson has been the standard for years. She's still ranked at the top of preseason lists. She's still treated by a lot of voters as the automatic frontrunner, the safe pick, the player who's earned the right to be in this conversation without even having to prove anything in the current season. And yet the actual on-court numbers in 2025 say something completely different than what the preseason narrative suggested. Wilson leads in scoring average. That matters. She also leads in blocks. That matters too, and nobody is taking that away from her. Her defensive impact is real and substantial, but Clark is doing more with less. Fewer games, more points created, more assists, more record-setting nights, and she's doing it while carrying a fever offense that leads the entire league in scoring. A team she basically built from the ground up over 3 seasons. That's not a small detail. That's the difference between putting up numbers and elevating an entire franchise. Here's the contrast that's actually worth examining and thinking about. Wilson started the season with the benefit of the doubt already built in from day one, 4 MVPs deep. Voters simply assumed she'd be back in that same spot by October. She was the default choice. Nobody questioned her spot at the top in June. Nobody made her prove anything before handing her the frontrunner label. She inherited that position because of what she did in previous seasons. The narrative was written before the season even started. Clark had to earn it under fire. She was ranked below 10 other guards at her own position by her own peers. That's not a small obstacle. That's a mountain to climb from. She had to answer questions about shooting slumps and whether the league had figured her out. She had to prove she belonged in top 5 conversations, let alone MVP conversations. Every step of the way, people were questioning whether she deserved to be in the room. Nobody gave her anything. Everything had to be earned. And once voters started reconsidering, once the numbers became so undeniable that they couldn't ignore them anymore, something interesting happened. The conversation didn't just shift slightly, it flipped completely. Clark didn't just crack the top 5. She moved into the top 1. She's now sitting ahead of Wilson in multiple statistical categories that matter for MVP voting. She's ahead of Kelsey Mitchell. She's ahead of every other candidate when you look at points generated per game. She's first in total scoring. She's tied for first in assists per game depending on the day. That contrast is exactly why this MVP conversation changed overnight. It's not that Wilson suddenly got worse. She's still playing at an elite level. It's that Clark got so undeniable so fast that voters had no choice but to reconsider everything they assumed about this race back in June. Once voters start reconsidering, the conversation rarely swings back the other way, especially when the player forcing that reconsideration keeps adding record after record to back it up. The defensive angle is worth mentioning too because it's a legitimate part of the discussion. Wilson is still one of the best defenders in this league. Her blocks are real. Her rim protection matters. Her defensive presence is something that impacts games in measurable ways. But Clark is also playing elite defense while generating historic offensive numbers. She had 4 steals and 2 blocks in that 45-10 game. She's not just an offensive force. She's a two-way player operating at an elite level on both sides of the court. Here's what makes this particularly interesting and frankly frustrating for Wilson. Wilson can keep saying she's been the greatest since 1996. Nobody is stopping her from believing that or saying it. But belief and box scores are 2 different things. And right now, the box scores belong to Clark. If this pace holds, and there's no real reason to think it won't, Clark isn't just going to be in the MVP conversation by the end of this season. She's going to be the name everyone is forced to say first. The team records also tell a story that's important to acknowledge. The Fever went from struggling to first in the East. They're one of the best teams in the league now. The team that Wilson is on, they're still very much in contention, but they're not having the same kind of surging performance. They're not scoring 94 points per game. They don't have that same level of offensive dominance that the Fever have established. That's part of what makes Clark's case so compelling. She's not just putting up numbers on a losing team, she's elevating an entire franchise. When you sit back and really look at what each player is doing, the story becomes clearer. Wilson is doing what she's always done, and it's excellent. But Clark is doing something we've never seen before in WNBA history. We've never seen a guard average over 20 points while averaging over 8 assists in a single season. We've never seen this specific combination of scoring and playmaking operate at this level. And that's what makes her case different. It's not that Wilson is playing poorly. It's that Clark has raised the standard so high that even excellent play doesn't measure up anymore. That's what happens when someone truly separates themselves from the rest of the field. They don't just compete. They reshape what everyone else's production looks like in comparison. Here's something that nobody wants to acknowledge directly, but it's become impossible to ignore anymore. This rise hasn't been a one-time thing. It's not a hot streak that came out of nowhere and will fade away in a few weeks. It's a pattern. A consistent and undeniable pattern of Caitlin Clark being underrated, dismissed, ranked below her actual production level, and then she goes out and makes that underrating look foolish within a matter of games. And this pattern has repeated itself multiple times this season in very specific and measurable ways. It happened with preseason rankings. Major outlets had her ranked outside the top 5. Some had her slipping from a 4th place ranking down to 11th in some positions. The preseason consensus seemed to be that Clark was good, but that she wasn't the elite tier player that her rookie numbers had suggested. Then the season started, and she immediately began producing at a level that contradicted those rankings completely. The numbers came out, and they made the rankings look amateur. It happened with the guard vote. Players voted her 11th. Within weeks, she was producing numbers that made that ranking look absurd in hindsight. She was generating more points than guards ranked ahead of her. She was distributing the ball at an elite level. She was scoring efficiently. The ranking seemed to age poorly in real time, and everyone who voted for her in that position had to watch it play out. And now it's happening with the MVP race itself. A conversation that completely excluded her just a few months ago now has her name sitting right at the very top. The MVP frontrunner status wasn't handed to her. It was earned through relentless production that made it impossible to ignore anymore. That's the pattern. Think about the mechanics of how this works. Someone underrates Clark. Media, peers, analysts, whoever. The underrating gets published or shared across platforms. It sits in the public consciousness for a bit. And then Clark goes out and puts up numbers so good that voters have to publicly reconsider and admit they might have been wrong. That's happened 3 times in one season. 3 separate instances where the gap between how she was rated and how she was actually performing became so wide that everyone had to do a complete 180. What's interesting is that this pattern doesn't suggest Clark had a sudden breakthrough that came out of nowhere. It suggests that the evaluation around her was consistently off. The numbers don't just improve once she's been ranked low. The numbers suggest she was that good all along, but people weren't seeing it correctly. They were filtered by preseason assumptions or peer bias or the narrative that the league had figured her out. Once she proved otherwise through production, suddenly everyone had to adjust their entire framework for how they evaluated her. The reason this pattern is significant is because it reveals something about how MVP voting works at the professional level. Voters don't come into the season with a completely open mind. They have assumptions. They have last year's narrative in their head. They have preseason predictions that anchor their thinking. And then reality unfolds differently than expected. Clark was supposed to be good, but not elite. She was supposed to be playing second fiddle at her own position. She was supposed to be a good rookie who had normalized into the regular player pool. That was the narrative. Reality says something different. Reality says she's operating at a historic level. Reality says her production is unprecedented for a guard in this league. Reality says she's doing things in fewer minutes that other players can't do in full workloads. But it takes a while for reality to overwrite the initial narrative. It takes repeated performances and record-setting nights and stat lines that nobody can rationalize away. Clark has also been named Conference Player of the Week 4 times this season. 4 separate weeks where the league's media voting panel looked at the previous week's performances and said, "This is the best player in this conference right now." That's not 1 week of acknowledgement. That's the system recognizing her excellence repeatedly. When a player earns that honor 4 separate times in a single season, you're not looking at a coincidence. You're looking at sustained excellence that keeps forcing recognition. The mid-range shooting development is also part of this pattern. She couldn't shoot mid-range jumpers when the season started. Or rather, she could, but it wasn't part of her offensive arsenal in a meaningful way. Then she worked on it. She spent time in the gym fixing her footwork, drilling the same pull-up jumper thousands of times in an empty gym, hoping it would translate once the lights came on and a defender was closing out at full speed. It translated. Now she's hit 32 mid-range shots this season, more than the previous 2 seasons combined. That's not luck. That's work. That's a player actively improving in real time while also maintaining elite production in every other area. The assists have been climbing too as the season has progressed. She's pushing her distributional impact higher and higher with each passing week. The scoring has remained consistent. The efficiency has stayed elite. The team wins are accumulating. Every statistical measure you look at shows a trajectory that's pointing upward, not plateauing or declining. That's not what someone looks like who's been figured out by the league. That's what someone looks like who's using every piece of feedback as fuel to get better. And here's what makes this pattern truly damning for the people who underrated her. They have to watch this unfold in real time. They have to see the player they ranked 11th sit at the top of the MVP conversation. They have to answer for it in podcasts. They have to defend the vote when reporters bring it up. They have to sit in locker rooms where her name keeps coming up whether they want it to or not. The disrespect isn't something they can hide anymore. It's something they have to confront repeatedly because the numbers keep proving them wrong. The pattern suggests that this MVP conversation isn't a temporary blip or a temporary deviation from the normal narrative. It's the natural conclusion of a season where Clark's production has been systematically underestimated and then proven right every single time. How many times can voters be wrong about the same player before they stop being wrong and start being foolish? We're past that point now. The pattern is clear. The numbers are undeniable. And the rest of the league is going to have to accept that Caitlin Clark has earned her way into a conversation that was supposed to be reserved for a Ja Wilson. We need to talk about what this all actually means, because the difference between where Clark's rise came from and where Wilson's throne came from is the real story here. It's not just about statistics and box scores. It's about the entire nature of recognition in professional sports and what happens when that recognition is inherited versus earned under fire with doubters everywhere. A'ja Wilson started this season with recognition already installed. 4 MVPs deep, 3 championships. A resume that made voters assume continuation was just the natural order of things. Nobody questioned her spot at the top in June. Nobody made her prove anything before handing her the frontrunner label. She had the benefit of the doubt because of what she'd done previously. She inherited the spotlight. The conversation was hers to lose, not hers to win. That's a very different position than what Clark was starting from. Clark had to climb from being ranked below 10 other guards at her own position just to get a seat at the same table. She wasn't handed anything. She wasn't assumed to be great based on previous accomplishments. She was dismissed, questioned, ranked below peers who put up worse numbers. And from that position of disrespect, she had to prove herself not just worthy of the MVP conversation, but worthy of being at the top of it. That's the difference between inheriting recognition and earning it under fire. That difference is also why this version of Clark's rise hits different than previous hype cycles. There have been other hype cycles in basketball history. There have been other moments where a young player burst onto the scene and captured attention, but those usually have the narrative already working in their favor. They usually come with media support and analyst backing from the beginning. Clark had to overcome the opposite. She had to move against the current while proving the current was wrong about her. That's a harder climb. And that's why this moment carries more weight. When players force themselves into narratives that were supposed to exclude them, when they do it repeatedly, when they do it by breaking records and setting firsts and producing at levels nobody has seen before, that changes how the conversation flows going forward. Once voters start reconsidering, the narrative doesn't swing back the other way easily. Especially when the player forcing that reconsideration keeps adding proof that the reconsideration was justified. So here's where this leaves A'ja Wilson right now. She's sitting at the top of a list that is starting to feel less secure by the week. She's watching a player she's shared headlines with for 2 years finally catch up in the one category that actually counts: current season production at a historic level. Wilson can keep saying she's been the greatest since 1996. Nobody is stopping her from believing that. But belief and box scores are 2 different things. And right now, the box scores belong to Clark. The throne that Wilson was sitting on so comfortably in June is feeling less stable now. The automatic frontrunner status that felt locked in is being challenged by someone who wasn't even in the conversation. The 4 MVPs she's already won don't guarantee a 5th. In fact, they might be working against her in some ways because voters might be looking for a changing of the guard, a new narrative, a fresh storyline that doesn't just end with A'ja Wilson wins again. There's only so much dominance the narrative can take before it wants something new. But it's not just about Wilson. It's about what this shift means for the entire league and for players everywhere. It's about what happens when someone refuses to accept the narrative that's been written about them. Clark didn't accept being 11th. She didn't accept being outside the MVP conversation. She didn't accept that being on a minute restriction meant she couldn't put up historic numbers. She just went out and produced at a level that made all of those narratives irrelevant. If this pace holds, and there's no real reason to think it won't based on the consistency and the work ethic, Clark isn't just going to be in the MVP conversation by the end of this season. She's going to be the name everyone is forced to say first, whether they ranked her 11th or not, whether Wilson wants to admit it in front of a camera or not, and whether the rest of the league is ready for that shift or not. That's not a prediction. That's just following the trajectory of the numbers. The numbers have been unambiguous: points generated per game, total scoring, assists, efficiency, record-setting performances, team wins, peer recognition through Conference Player of the Week awards. Every statistical category that matters is pointing in the same direction. And that direction is a path straight to an MVP award that was supposed to belong to someone else. What makes this particularly significant is that it didn't happen gradually. It didn't unfold over months. It happened fast. Within weeks of being ranked 11th, Clark had positioned herself as the frontrunner. The speed of that shift is what makes it so undeniable. If this had taken an entire season, you could rationalize it as evolution, as natural progression. But it didn't. It happened quickly. It happened in response to disrespect. And it happened with such force that it couldn't be ignored. The psychological element of this is worth examining too. When someone is disrespected in a public and official way, ranked 11th by peers, it creates a situation where they either shrink from it or use it as fuel. Clark used it as fuel. She didn't let the ranking define her season. She let her production define her season. And her production has been so overwhelming that the ranking looks worse every single day. So where does that leave us? It leaves us watching one of the most fascinating narratives in women's basketball right now. A player who was supposed to stay in her lane being forced to the top. A throne that felt unshakable being challenged by someone who wasn't even supposed to be in the running. A conversation that seemed closed being opened wide enough that everyone has to reconsider who they thought this MVP race was going to be about. Ask yourself why a player who was ranked 11th at her own position by her peers just months ago is now generating the most points created in a single game in league history, leading the entire MVP field in scoring and assists, and collecting Player of the Week honors on repeat. Either those player votes were completely wrong, or Caitlin Clark simply refused to let a wrong opinion define the rest of her season. Based on everything sitting in the stat sheet right now, it's clearly the second one. The numbers don't lie, the records don't fabricate themselves, the assists per game don't accumulate by accident. This was earned, this was proven. This was forced into existence through relentless production that nobody could rationalize away. A'ja Wilson's grip on the MVP conversation isn't gone yet, but it's slipping. And by the end of this season, Caitlin Clark won't just be in the conversation. She'll be the conversation. That's not a debate anymore. That's just where the numbers are taking us, and the numbers don't care about what happened in July.